Hey, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, and I am pleased to welcome you to our Azure AD and Active Directory, What's New and What's Hot Summit, brought to you by Ativo Networks, a SentinelOne company, Eminami, and Zoho. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when a replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a pair of high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling Bluetooth headphones. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. What's hot in Azure AD/Active Directory, a 50-minute overview featuring Nathan O'Brien, Microsoft MVP. From Portland, Oregon, Nathan is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master, Messaging, and a 5-time former Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, Azure, and Teams. Working as an independent consultant, he actively contributes to the Exchange and Office 365 communities by writing articles for several tech websites and his own blog. Nathan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Glad you could all join us here today. Looks like we have a decent-sized crowd that will be joining us for our sessions this morning. Very glad you could all be here. As David said, I am Nathan O'Brien. I'm going to be talking for the next 40 minutes or so about some new features in on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. If at any time during my presentation here you have any questions, please feel free to open up that Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions in there. I'm going to try and stop talking by about 9:40, or 40 minutes after the hour, depending on your time zone there, 40 minutes after the hour, to get a good 10 or 15 minutes of questions in before we wrap up. Then I'm going to wrap it up just a couple minutes early, so give you all a minute break before we go on to the next session. All right, with that, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about new features and functionality in Azure Active Directory and on-premises Active Directory domain services. Features I'm going to talk about may be in public preview or generally available. I think I marked everything at the top of each slide for each feature. It says whether that feature is GA or in public preview. The major distinction there is that features that are in public preview may change at least slightly before they go to general availability. So you should be aware if you're playing with any of these new features and it's a feature that is in public preview, those features may change around a bit. Things may be a little bit different before they go to general availability. And then features that are in general availability, Microsoft expects those features not to change a whole lot, but as you probably know, everything in Azure and Office 365 changes all the time. So even features that are in general availability listed here may change if you're watching this, a recording of this later, something like that. Try to keep everything as current as possible, but everything changes in the cloud pretty frequently. And then mostly we're going to talk about Azure Active Directory features, but I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about on-premises Active Directory. So Windows Server 2022, newest version of Windows Server. There are aren't really any significant changes to Active Directory domain services within Windows Server 2022. So if you have one of the more recent versions of Active Directory running on older versions, domain controllers, you're not going to get a whole bunch of new features by upgrading to Windows Server 2022. That being said, Windows Server 2022, most of the updates to it are security features that make your Active Directory more secure. I still think it's a good idea to upgrade and do that. I'm a consultant. I go into a lot of different customer organization Active Directories fairly regularly, and I would say Active Directory updates tend to be something that lots of organizations kind of lag on, keeping their Active Directory up to date. Very good reason for that. I totally understand it. Not a big, necessarily not a big reward or not a lot of new reasons to upgrade your domain and forest function level there, feature-wise usually. And there can be significant risk. Obviously, if you have that Active Directory, upgrading Active Directory itself is relatively easy, but it's really all the applications that are authenticating to Active Directory when you do an Active Directory upgrade. You can mess stuff up if your existing applications don't work with the newer version of Active Directory or those newer domain controllers that it's authenticating to. So I certainly understand why organizations can be a little bit slow to keep their Active Directory up to the most current functional levels, but it's still a good idea to do that. A couple of new features that I did want to mention within Windows Server 2022, just while we're here. It does support nesting virtual servers. It's kind of neat. Doesn't really have anything to do with Active Directory or Azure Active Directory, but kind of a neat feature. I don't know that it's necessarily something that I've seen a whole bunch of use cases for, but handy feature there. SMB improvements. SMB in Windows Server 2022, that's server message blocks, kind of a basic communication between all your servers there in your Windows servers. SMB now uses AES-256 encryption. It is much more secure. If you have older Windows servers, deployed, they're using those older versions of SMB. That is a huge security issue. Definitely needs to be corrected, updated, and fixed. There are a couple of different virtualization-based security improvements into Windows Server 2022. And of course, Windows Server 2022 by default only uses TLS 1.3, which is much more secure than older versions of TLS. Definitely you want to disable those older versions of TLS if you do have older Windows servers in your environment. Ensure that TLS 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, ensure that those are disabled wherever possible. Those older versions of TLS are insecure. All right, and that pretty much wraps up everything we have to say about the on-premises Active Directory sort of stuff. The rest of this presentation is mostly going to be Azure Active Directory things, with the exception of, I want to talk quickly about Azure Active Directory Connect, kind of that bridge between your on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Last month, there was a new version of AAD Connect that was released, version 2.1.15.0, released for download in the beginning of July, and then will be made available for auto upgrade soon, which certainly should be by now. And remember, when you install your AAD Connect server, if you going through that wizard, if you choose the Express install, which is kind of the default on there, that is going to set your AAD Connect server to auto update. So when new versions of AAD Connect are available, your server will call home to Microsoft, and then it will automatically update to new versions of AAD Connect. If you do not choose the Express install, go with the custom install option, then your AAD Connect server is not auto-upgrading So you would need to upgrade that server manually if there are new versions. Please make sure you know which option you chose when you set up your AAD Connect server, and understand whether you need to do that auto up, or you need to do that AAD Connect version update yourself, or if that's automatically going to be taken care of for you. Have seen, like once or twice, I have seen little issues with the AAD Connect auto upgrade that has caused headaches for some customers. I don't think it's ever been anything really terribly bad, but some people don't like that auto upgrade stuff turned on in their environments. Certainly understand why. With AAD Connect, it's pretty low risk to have that turned on and going. And remember, if something does go wrong with your AAD Connect server, you can just turn it off and then build a new one. It's not really a service that needs high availability, or if it's down, it's going to cause you huge problems. You just can't provision new users in your on-premises Active Directory and have them sync up into Azure Active Directory. This AAD Connect update does include some new attributes. They are mostly custom attribute extension things that you can use, customize. Not really anything that's, I don't think there are any well-known attributes that were added to that. Anything that's real game-changing. It's just mostly custom attributes. And this version of AAD Connect does include the git and set commands for AD Sync Tools Duplicate User Source Anchor. That is a new PowerShell feature that allows you to fix source anchor as changed errors in bulk. So if you have run into that error with your Azure Active Directory environment, that new PowerShell tool will allow you to fix all that quickly in bulk for all the users. Any questions on AAD Connect? Please throw those into the question window, and we will get to those at the end. That being said, let's look at some new features in Azure Active Directory. Okay. First new Azure Active Directory feature I wanted to talk about is trusts for user forests. This is in public preview, so again, may change as time goes on before it's generally available. But with this update, you can create a trust between an Azure Active Directory forest and your on-premises forest. That is fairly limited, however. There are some pretty big limitations in that before we get too excited about it. The first is that you have to create a customized managed domain in Azure Domain Services for a trust to be possible. So when most people, if they're using Azure Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory forest was created when you created an Office 365 tenant, and it's linked to that. Those Azure Active Directory forests do not yet support creating a trust with an on-premises Active Directory. The only way to have an Azure Active Directory forest that does support creating a trust with your on-premises forest is you need to manually go into Azure Active Directory and create a customized managed domain in Azure Domain Services. So, if you're all scrambling and looking at your Azure Active Directory forests right now and trying to add in a trust, or looking for where you can add in a trust, you won't see that unless you created a separate managed domain. Then once you do that, you can create a one-way outbound trust from Azure Active Directory Domain Services to one or more on-premises Active Directory. That is one-way and outbound, so that your on-premises Active Directory forest will trust this Azure Active Directory forest, which means you can log on and access on-premises resources with your Azure Active Directory accounts. Not the other way around. So there are some limitations there. And this trust relationship lets users, applications, computers authenticate into your on-premises domain with your Azure Active Directory credentials. Any questions about that? Again, please feel free to put them in the chat. Quarter after here. So we've got a bunch of features to cover. I should probably speed up a little bit, but we'll see what we get to. New feature, you can create groups in administrative units. This is again in public preview. So if you have the group administrators role assigned to your account over the scope of an administrative unit, you can now create groups within that administrative unit. There's actually a few features we're going to talk about that are around administrative units. So an administrative unit is kind of the Azure Active Directory equivalent of an organizational unit. It allows you to delegate parts of that Active Directory force for management by specific people. In my experience, probably the most common use case for this would be like a executive help desk or a subset of your normal help desk where those people work with work with the executives, and they're the only people that have the rights to those executive accounts. You could create an administrative unit, put your executives in there, and then delegate rights to that to just those specific people, so that they would have the ability, and they would be the only ones with the ability to manage those specific accounts. With this new update, group administrators can create groups that they can manage directly without needing to elevate to global administrator or privileged role administrator roles. So this allows you to create and manage groups within administrative units without having those higher permission roles made available. Handy new feature. All right, next feature we want to talk about, dynamic administrative unit support for on-premises distinguished name property. Again, in public preview. So what this new feature allows is in a dynamic administrative unit, so an administrative unit where the membership, people who are put into that administrative unit is controlled dynamically, now supports the on-premises distinguished name property. What that means is that with this all set up and configured, you could move a user to a specific OU in your on-premises Active Directory, and then via your AAD Connect sync into Azure Active Directory, that information would go up into Azure Active Directory, and then a dynamic administrative group, or a dynamic administrative unit, can pick up the membership of that person and then add it to that administrative unit based on their on-premises OU management. Hopefully that makes, or their on-premises OU membership, Hopefully that all makes sense. So you can put a user in an OU on-premise and have that control the user's membership in an AU in Azure Active Directory. Handy new feature allows you to assign that AU membership based on OU membership on-premises. Pretty handy feature. Little bit confusing, a little bit hard to go through, but once you get your head around it, this is a good way to kind of segment out your Azure Active Directory management and allow, so if you have people in the Portland office, for instance, you have administrators whose job it is to manage those specific users and those users only, you can use this to kind of segregate out your management so that people are managing the users in just their office without having full rights to your entire Azure Active Directory deployment. All right, next feature we want to talk about, multiple passwordless phone sign-in accounts for iOS devices. So I always encourage people to use multi-factor authentication, of course, and then with that, I think that the best method for doing multi-factor authentication is with the Microsoft Authenticator app. Microsoft Authenticator app gives you a number of additional MFA features that I think are very handy, including passwordless sign-in. Until very recently, however, if you're using Microsoft Authenticator for passwordless sign-in, that Microsoft Authenticator could only allow passwordless authentication with one account. I, as a person who has my personal Office 365 tenant, then I have my work Office 365 tenant, and then I have, however many customers I'm working with at any given time. It was handy to be able to now use my same Microsoft Authenticator app on my iPhone to use that passwordless authentication to multiple different accounts in either the same Office 365 tenant or in multiple different tenants. This is a handy update. I think it's very good. Android is not yet supported for multiple accounts. We can presume that Microsoft is working on that and will be available fairly soon. Before we move on to another feature, I kind of want to show you the settings for configuring that Microsoft Authenticator settings. Here you can see this is my Azure Active Directory tenant. And then if you hit the little configure button that's covered up by that flyout on the right, you get this flyout window on the right there where you can see I have the set passwordless authentication mode. And then I've turned on number matching and show additional context in the Microsoft Authenticator app. You control that in Azure Active Directory. And then when you go to authenticate into Office 365 or Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft Authenticator pop-up that you get on your phone will look like this, what I have up here on the screen now. So it gives you that additional context. You can see that I am trying to authenticate here to the MCSM Lab tenant. You can see the account I'm trying to authenticate with, my account there within my tenant. And then it puts a number on in your browser where you're signing in that you have to take that number from the browser and type it here into your phone to ensure that you're the right person authenticating in there. Also gives you a little additional information. You can see that I'm trying to authenticate here to Remote PowerShell for Exchange Online, and then you can see where that session is. So you make sure that the person, the person who's authenticating is you, and you're not getting an authentication prompt from somebody trying to authenticate from Russia or China or whatever. So Microsoft Authenticator, very good multi-factor authentication option, highly recommended. I think everybody should be using that as much as possible. And with these additional features, I think it makes it more secure than other authentication apps, or just a simple pop-up that says, are you trying to authenticate? Yes, no. This additional context makes your authentication more secure. All right, next feature we want to talk about, improvements to Azure AD Smart Lockout. So Smart Lockout's a feature within Azure Active Directory that can kind of adjust that how many authentication attempts fail before it locks you out, kind of on the fly. So the feature is generally available. Really the improvement that they made to Azure AD Smart Lockout is that lockout status, or the number of attempts and the lockout status, is synchronized across Azure Active Directory data centers now, so that if someone were to try and authenticate Azure Active Directory, they hit data center 1, and then it doesn't work. Previously, it was possible, even with Smart Lockout on, for that user or that attempted hacker or whatever to attempt to authenticate to a different Azure Active Directory data center and kind of get past that Smart Lockout. But this improvement makes that impossible now. That's synchronized across all the Azure Active Directory data centers, I believe regionally, almost instantly. Making Smart Lockout more secure. Very good. Next feature we want to talk about here is fine-grained permissions. So we see this a lot. Obviously, everybody's interested in that least privilege model. You don't want to give global admin permissions to everybody who's working in your Office 365 tenant. The early days of Office 365, that's pretty much the only option you had. You had to be a global admin to do anything worthwhile within that tenant. And then over the years, Microsoft has been expanding those roles and those fine-grained permissions so that you could give people permissions specifically to the tasks that they need to do without giving them, full permissions to everything. So this specific feature, you no longer need Azure Contributor or Azure AD Global Admin to set up and administer your ADS instance. The link there that I put at the bottom, that lists all the different Azure Active Directory roles that are pre-set up for you that you can use for fine-grained permissions. There are a lot of them. It was way more than I could reasonably fit on a slide or even a couple of slides. But definitely go check out that link. And then as you're permissioning administrative accounts within your Office 365 tenant, that will allow you to give much better control over the rights that individual people have. You can match their job role to specifically created roles within Azure Active Directory so that they only have the permissions they need, giving you much better security within your Azure Active Directory tenants. All right, got about 15 minutes of me talking left, and then we'll get to some questions. A few more features we want to talk about. But again, if anybody has any questions that they would like me to address at the end, and I do see a few coming in here, go ahead, open up that Q&A panel at the bottom. Put your questions in there, and then we will get to those in just a few minutes. All right. New Azure AD portal, all users list, and user profile user interface. Kind of a confusing title there, not super well written, but what this is the user list in your Azure Active Directory portal. They've made some improvements to that so that you can manage those users better. They have turned on infinite scrolling, so that immediately when you open up that list of users, all your users will load there instead of just that, getting that load more and doing 50 at a time or whatever. There are more user properties that can be added as columns and filtered on within that portal, so you can better filter your users. Tasks that we previously had to do with PowerShell to sort out the list by specific your user list by specific properties. Now more of those properties you can sort the list by in that web portal. Columns can be reordered via drag and drop, so you can move your columns around there. The default columns shown in their order can be managed via the column picker, so you can change those default columns with the column picker. And you have the ability to copy and share the current view so that you can set up a view of your Azure Active Directory users, and then you can copy and share it to the other administrators. So if somebody needs a view of just the users in a specific office or users who have specific settings, you can kind of set up that view and share it among your other administrators so that everybody can gain that same GUI view of your users pretty quickly and easily. Handy new feature there. Always like to see those. Next feature we want to talk about here is Azure AD Portal All Devices List. Much like the All Users list, this is a similar update to the portal that shows you more device information, making it easier to filter and manage on your devices. So again, this is very similar to the last feature with users. They just also updated the portal that shows you your devices. Infinite scrolling, more device properties can be filtered on, columns can be reordered via drag and drop, select all devices. So again, this is pretty much the same thing as the last feature, just for devices. About 10 more minutes and 5 or 6 more of these to talk through, so I think we're doing well on time there. All right, roles being assigned out of privileged identity management. So this is a new feature. Privileged identity management is absolutely a great feature within Office 365 and Azure Active Directory that allows you to have a standard user account. So my user account within my Office 365 tenant, as we're sitting and talking here now, that account doesn't have any admin privileges within my tenant. To activate those admin privileges, I need to go into privileged identity management and assign myself those roles. Of course, privileged identity management also gives you the ability to have an approver for those roles, so people can go in and request those roles be assigned to them, and then before those permissions are activated, the approver has to approve those roles. What this update does is if you have that set up so that you're using privileged identity management, and you have those approvers for roles, this feature can send those approvers an update when roles are assigned to administrators outside of privileged identity management. So if somebody has, standing global admin rights and they give those rights to someone else, then an email will be sent to whomever it is that you designate as kind of that privileged identity approver person, so that they'll be aware that there is a new person who has a permanent assignment of roles outside of privileged identity management. This is really just an automated way for you to keep better track of who has administrative rights within your Azure Active Directory and kind of prevent that admin creep that we all know happens. To go into our Active Directory and look, I think most of us would agree that most of the time we'll see there are additional administrators that, somebody needed admin rights for something for 15 minutes to do a specific change, and they got way too many rights were assigned to them, and those rights never went away. So they just have that standing admin account for, way too long. This is a great way to help control that, kind of prevent that administrative role spread that seems all too common within all of our environments. Temporary access pass is now generally available. So this is a new authentication method into Azure Active Directory that you can set up, and it's intended for kind of that provisioning process when users have a new account and they need to be able to get into Azure Active Directory so that they can set up, their account and change their password and do that, set up their multi-factor authentication or their self-service password reset options, all that information. A temporary access pass is a new way that you can control that without having that kind of default password that's sent to people. So when you create a new Office 365 account, I'm sure most of you have done this, Microsoft kind of gives you that default. I think it's usually a 6-letter password that then you mail out that to the user, and then the user's forced to change the password at the next logon. Temporary access pass allows them to get in for that first time to set up all their password and their multi-factor authentication and their self-service password reset options without you having to send them that temporary password. Also makes it easier to recover when users lost or forgotten their strong authentication methods and needs to sign in and register for new authentication methods. So instead of doing a password reset, you can also use temporary access pass to allow a user to get in without that temporary password, so that they can then correct their standard password. This is a screenshot again from my tenant. So if you go into Azure Active Directory, security, and authentication methods, you will see the temporary access pass there, second one from the bottom. You can turn that on, allow users to use it, and then you will have those temporary access passes will be available. Then you can go into a specific user's account and issue a temporary access pass for those users instead of doing a password reset, so that they can then get in and correct whatever the issue is that they have going on. Again, any questions about any of this, feel free to put them into the Q&A. Just have about 5 more minutes scheduled for me talking here and a couple more slides to go before we get to your questions. All right, dynamic group support for member of. So Azure Active Directory dynamic groups can now support having groups as members. That makes sense. So you can have an Azure Active Directory dynamic group and put in a standard group as a member of that dynamic group. And then membership, of course, in that standard group will be passed to whatever the rights and configurations are for that dynamic group. Dynamic group licensing requirements still stand. I believe you have to have Azure AD P2 licenses to use dynamic groups. Not 100% sure on that. Could be P1, but it's definitely more of a license than just your standard Azure Active Directory license. You would need at least a P1. I think maybe it's a P2 license. Of course, dynamic group membership is calculated at time of use, depending on what the use of that dynamic group is. If you're sending an email to it, then when that email gets to is sent and the transport layer is figuring out who it's going to, it calculates dynamic group membership at that time. Or if the user logs in, then dynamic group membership is calculated at login. Still, if you add somebody to a dynamic group after they've logged in, that isn't going to go through and update their access tokens. So they would have whatever that is. Users still have to log in or log off and then log back in before they get those rights. And then as of now, there are specific steps to take during the setup of a dynamic group to support this feature. I didn't demonstrate that all out there, but you should be aware that there is more to it you have to do to support the member, to support a dynamic group having a standard group as its member. There are some more steps that you have to take because it's in public preview and is likely to change how that all works. I didn't list that all out here in slides, but be aware of that. All right, and the last feature I wanted to talk about before we get into the questions, more device properties supported for dynamic device groups. So a dynamic device group is a group of devices that is, again, dynamic and calculated at time of use. You can have device groups so that membership in that group is calculated for devices. You can create dynamic groups for devices or for users, but you can't create a dynamic group that contains both users and devices. So those do have to be separate dynamic groups, but you can create each type separately. And you can't create a device group based on the user attributes of the device owner. It can only be attributes of the actual device itself. Device membership rules can reference only the device attributes. But it is handy to have those dynamic groups for devices so that you can create different groups and have those dynamically updated, including device groups. All right, so that is all the features that I have, and we are right about at time here, so we've got about 15 minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, we will now go to the Q&A here, and David will help me out. David, do you see any exciting questions that we want to address here?
Yes, we do. Great stuff, Nathan. And let's get to those questions. But first, I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's go to the Q&A box. Take them as they appear. Here's a question from Michael in the audience. Michael asks, when adding a standard group to an AAD dynamic group, can the standard group be synced from on-prem, or is it cloud only?
Great question, and yes. So it can be an on-premises group that is mastered in your, or the source of authority for that group is your on-premises Active Directory that is then synced via AAD Connect into Azure Active Directory. Those groups can be members of dynamic groups for this new dynamic group member of feature. So yes, you can use on-premises groups for that.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Briza. Is it necessary to authenticate all Azure services with Azure AD?
Is it necessary to authenticate all Azure services with Azure AD? Yes, I think so. I can't imagine. I can't think of any services within Azure that you would be able to access without authenticating to Azure Active Directory. Whether that's via a synced group or a synced account or a cloud-only account, a federated account, pretty much has to be an Azure Active Directory account that you're using for authentication to all Azure services. As far as I know, I can't think of any scenario where it wouldn't be.
Okay. Next question comes from John in the audience. John asks, can you connect the dynamic device group to an AU?
Yes, you absolutely can have a dynamic device group that is connected to an AU like that. Yes, absolutely can. Easy questions with straightforward answers so far this morning. Great.
Okay. Here's one that just popped in. I don't know if you know about this. Will there be any change to SharePoint support?
Sure. I mean, there's always changes to SharePoint, specifically SharePoint Online. That's not really, we're doing Azure Active Directory and on-premises Active Directory in this session today, so I didn't look at any specifically new SharePoint features for this. But there's always stuff being updated there would be the answer. If you have specific SharePoint features that you'd like to ask about, I'm happy to try and address that. If you'd like this morning. With that being said, I'm not really a SharePoint guy, so probably wouldn't be able to give you a great answer, but if you have any specific questions, feel free, Carlos, to put them in there, and I will see what I can do within the time that we have remaining.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move forward here. Here's a question from Jeff. Regarding PAP, what does the user see when a PAP is issued?
Yeah, so a temporary access pass is what we're talking about, the new authentication feature within Azure Active Directory that allows you to kind of authenticate users into their Azure Active Directory account without giving them a password. It's essentially what they see. They get a code that's essentially the same as a one-time password. It's very similar to that kind of temporary password. Just it only works for a set amount of time. So it's very simple. What the user gets is very similar to the temporary passwords.
Okay. Here's a question from Dinesh. In dynamic group member feature, we need to give GUID of each group, which we need to consolidate. Do we do any other automation then to add each group's GUID?
I'm not sure that I understand the question there. So in dynamic group member feature, so when you create a dynamic group, has a GUID. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question there, Dinesh. Asking about the GUIDs of dynamic groups, creating them. I don't believe there's any other automation that you do, or you don't manually assign a GUID to a group when you create a group. Not sure what the question is or what you're looking for there. So if you could clarify that would be helpful. I'm not sure what we're looking for.
Okay, great. Maybe Dinesh can send in a clarification. We have plenty of time for that. Oh, here's something from Michael about that. He says, I think he means object ID of child group. Anyway, Dinesh, if you want to send in a clarification, we'll move right along to the next question, which comes from Prabha. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he admits it may not be very relevant to your presentation, but how do I use or enable existing identities, that is Google or Facebook account, along with the Azure AD.
Okay. So you want to authenticate to Azure Active Directory with a Google or a Facebook account. Don't do that, please. I mean,
okay.
You can't. So I guess there are a lot of you'll see a lot of web applications these days that give you the option to authenticate into the Twitter. You can authenticate with a Twitter email account, a Twitter account, or with your Apple account, or with different accounts. But no, you can't. Use a Google account to authenticate into Azure Active Directory. I guess there's probably, using Microsoft Information Manager, there's probably something you could cook up to kind of sync accounts and do something there, but doesn't sound like a good idea.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. And let's move along to the next question from Mario. Can Office 365 group be a member of another Office 365 group in Exchange Online?
So I assume we're talking about capital letter groups, Office 365 groups, which isn't a standard lowercase group. And I love Microsoft's naming convention for everything. Sometimes these things can be confusing, but Office 365 groups is a feature of Office 365 that has additional functionality beyond just standard group. So you're asking, can Office 365 groups be nested? No, I don't believe they can. You cannot put an Office 365 group as a member of another Office 365 group. So Office 365 groups do not, as far as I'm aware, support nesting. No. And we've got a couple more minutes here, about 3 more minutes before we get to that 9:50, and then we'll give you all a break before we move on to the next presentation. So let's try and hit a couple more of these questions.
Okay, and we have some. Wide variety. Here's one from Cedro. As the old MFA setup is being deprecated, some of the functionality is being removed. Are there any plans in the future to bring those items back to the new setup?
The old MFA setup is being deprecated. Some of the functionality is being removed. I'm not sure what specific MFA functionality, Isidro, that you are talking about. If you have specific features that are you talking about? I don't even know. Not sure what features you're talking about that are being removed, so I wouldn't know if those features will be back in some other new setup. Not sure. If you want to hit me on Twitter, I can, or you've probably seen my email a couple of times here throughout the presentation. Not that hard to figure out how to get a hold of me. If this or any of the other questions that we're not able to get to are going to run out of time here shortly, we have a number more questions. If there's any questions that I can't answer during the presentation, pretty easy to get a hold of. Put my Twitter handle up at the top of the presentation. Probably see my email address a couple times in here. Feel free to contact me after, and I will do my best to answer anything that I can.
Okay.
Probably time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, here's one from Joel. He says, passwordless for multiple accounts. Do we know when Android support may be available in preview?
We do not. I don't have any information that I can release about that. So no, I don't know when Android support for multiple password accounts will be available within Microsoft Authenticator.
Okay, here's another question. Do you know if on-premises AD is going to go away?
That's kind of an interesting question. I think, as we all know, Microsoft is far more interested in being a cloud services company than they are in being a company that sells software. So probably not a lot. Microsoft doesn't have a lot of interest in selling on-premises versions of any software. But to the best of my knowledge, I would say that, Windows Server and Windows for your laptop are going to be products that Microsoft continues to support and release for quite some time to come, which means on-premises Active Directory, I would think, is going to be a feature that's going to be around for quite a while yet. I don't expect that to go away now.
Okay, that makes sense. And the next question, how do you keep up with new features from Microsoft? Maybe tailor that to what's the best way to keep up with new features from Microsoft about Azure AD and the subject that you're talking?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, there are 300 plus of you that are, listening to our lovely webcast here this morning with what I have to say. And then Brian will be on after me, and he'll probably say more new and exciting things. So I think the first thing, you're already doing it. You're listening to, this sort of webcast and other resources that you can get around the internet to kind of keep up like that. Each of Microsoft's product groups generally has a blog. So if you're looking for new features in Exchange Online, for instance, they have a ELO blog. Just look Exchange Online blog, type it into your favorite search engine, and you'll find a blog for most of certainly the cloud products, Exchange, SharePoint, Azure Active Directory. That's where I got a lot of the features that I talked about today in the Azure, in this presentation, going through the Azure Active Directory blog and kind of looking at recent features that Microsoft has updated there. Beyond that, I would say the MVP community, the Microsoft MVPs community is a good collection of people who spend quite a lot of time diving into these features, kind of explaining it. Often they do a better job in their own blog posts and presentations of kind of explaining how features work over the kind of Microsoft standard documentation that you see on docs.microsoft.com. So there are a number of different ways that you can keep up with new features and functionalities in Azure and Office 365. Microsoft blogs, MVP blogs, that sort of thing work really well.
Okay.
All right, and then maybe one more question.
Well, actually, I have a question. As we're talking about new features, you mentioned towards the beginning of your presentation several new features that are now available in public preview. Do any of those stand out that might be especially interesting or useful for our audience?
Yeah, so, I tried, within the presentation, I tried to hit those features that I thought were interesting and recently released and things that people would be interested in. There were some other new features that I kind of didn't include in the session because those features were more technical or more difficult to explain kind of in the format and the time that we have here today. But I would say, again, kind of go back to those Microsoft blogs and MVP blogs, look for kind of new features that way, and then you can dive into those features. Each feature, as stuff goes on, other people are going to be more interested in kind of different features and different functionalities. So it's hard to give specific kind of features that everybody's going to be interested in, but that was kind of what I was going for today. And I think that kind of puts us at time. So, David, let's wrap this up and get on to Brian's presentation.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Nathan, for a great presentation and answering all those questions. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, New Best Practices for Azure AD/Active Directory. So take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Ativo Networks, a SentinelOne company, Eminami, and Zoho, and we'll be right back.
Welcome, everyone. The event is now live. Chris, please take it away.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsors, Ativo Networks, a SentinelOne company, Imanami, and Zoho for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paley, editor, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Azure AD and Active Directory What's New and What's Hot Summit, called New Best Practices for Azure AD Active Directory. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, Microsoft MVP and commercial astronaut candidate. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author, 21-time Microsoft MVP, and a commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books, has created numerous full-length video training courses, and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found on redmondmag.com in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his Posey's Moonshot column. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. So hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking all about Active Directory security best practices, and of course that includes Azure AD as well. Now, as I'm sure some of you know, this is a topic that I've been asked to speak on numerous times in recent months. And, you know, in some ways it's worked out because there are a lot of different Active Directory best practices. But what I want to do for this particular presentation is to try to dig in and find the newest, most recent Active Directory best practices. So that's what I've got. The best practices that I'm going to be covering, and there are 11 of them, are based on the article that is hyperlinked on the slide. Now, the reason why I chose this particular article is because it was the most recent best practices that I could find from Microsoft. It's from earlier this year. So these best practices are only a few months old. Now, some of the best practices are probably things that you've heard a million times. You may have even heard me mention them a million times. And that's okay because that doesn't diminish their importance. So I am going to be talking about some of those just because they are important. Now, some of the other best practices are things that I'm pretty sure I've never discussed before, so there's definitely going to be plenty of new material here as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, best practice number one is that identity is the new perimeter. Now, this is something that I believe I have mentioned previously, but it's one of those really, really important concepts to wrap your head around if you haven't already. In my mind, the idea that identity is the new perimeter points to the fundamental transformation of IT as a whole. This is where the entire industry is headed right now if it's not already there. So what does this mean? Well, if you really think about IT historically, the way that we did things in the distant past was everything was confined to a data center, and our end users worked in an office that was located in somewhat close proximity to that data center. And as long as you kept the users happy, everything up and running, you kept the bad guys out, and you kept any of the data from leaving the network and going where it wasn't supposed to, you were doing a great job. So all you really had to worry about was the resources that were confined within those four walls of your data center, and of course any office space that your users were using. Well, that's no longer the case. Some would argue, including myself, that the perimeter has become increasingly irrelevant. Because if you really think about it, yes, a lot of us still have data centers. Yes, there are applications and other workloads that continue to run in those data centers. But the data center is not the exclusive domain for our workloads that we're running. Many of those workloads are hosted in the cloud, and typically not just one cloud. They're scattered across multiple clouds. And the same thing for the users. We no longer have a situation in which all of the users are located in one place. Oftentimes, users are working from home. And I would say that even now, there are probably more users working remotely than are working in the office. So the point being that the perimeter has completely evaporated. It doesn't exist anymore for all practical purposes. You have applications that are scattered everywhere. You have users that are scattered everywhere. So the idea of protecting the perimeter just really doesn't make sense anymore. So if the perimeter doesn't exist, what do you protect? Well, the answer to that is identity. The user's identity is what allows them to access the various business workloads. And it's what you use to keep those workloads secure in many cases. So identity is really where you need to be focusing your priorities. So best practice number two, centralize identity management. It shouldn't really come as much surprise that since identity is the new perimeter and it's where you need to be focusing your attention, that the second best practice revolves around the idea of centralizing identity management. So what does this really mean? Well, the article that I mentioned earlier takes kind of a scattered approach to the idea of centralized identity management, but they've thrown out several different bullet point items that I'll elaborate on a little bit. The first one is establish a single Active Directory instance, establish a single Azure AD instance. The idea behind this is that a lot of organizations took a piecemeal approach to the cloud when it first started becoming popular. Maybe they set up a Microsoft 365 account, maybe they set up an Azure AD subscription, maybe they have multiple Azure AD subscriptions linked to various departments. Well, those multi-tenant environments do work and they're extremely common, but the problem with that is that if it's not done correctly, you can end up in situations where there are multiple instances of user accounts scattered among different Active Directory or Azure AD instances. So, for example, you might have an Active Directory environment in one cloud. You might have a couple of different Azure AD subscriptions, each with duplicate user identities, and that becomes really, really tough to manage. So I'm not saying that you should do away with your multi-tenancy. Multi-tenancy definitely has its place, but wherever you can, it's a good idea to centralize your user identities. The phrase that gets used oftentimes is one source of the truth. So, one account for each user wherever possible. That's going to make your user identities much, much easier to manage and secure. The second bullet point, integrate your on-premises Active Directory with Azure AD. This is something that I would guess most organizations are probably already doing, but the idea is that Microsoft offers a tool called Azure AD Connect that you can use to synchronize your on-premises Active Directory up to Azure AD, and that works whether you're using a standard Azure subscription or if you're using Azure AD as a part of a Microsoft 365 subscription. Either way, you can use Azure AD Connect to synchronize your on-premises Active Directory environment up to the Azure Active Directory. The third bullet point, don't synchronize accounts to Azure AD that have high privileges in your existing Active Directory environment. So the basic idea behind this one is that any organization that has an on-premises Active Directory environment probably has certain privileged accounts that are exclusive to that environment. Maybe they're used to manage certain resources that only exist on premises. Well, if a resource only exists on premises, there's really no reason to synchronize privileged accounts that go with that resource up to the Azure Active Directory cloud. It's better to keep those particular identities on premises where they're actually used rather than synchronizing them up to the cloud, because really what purpose are they going to serve once they're up there? And then the next item on the list is turn on password hash synchronization. This one is often regarded as a security best practice, but I tend to think of it more as a practicality type issue. The idea is really simple. Passwords are stored as hashes. In other words, a user enters a password, there's a mathematical algorithm that's run against that password, and it converts that password into an unreadable hash. It's human readable, but it doesn't reflect what the password is. So the idea being that you should synchronize those hashes up to Azure AD. Now, why is that? Well, it tends to prevent a lot of confusion. Let's imagine for a moment that a user has an on-premises Active Directory account, and you've synchronized that account up to Azure AD. Now let's say that a user is working remotely one day, and so they log directly into the Azure AD environment, and while they're in there, they change their password. Well, at that point, they've got two different passwords. They have one password on premises, and then they've got a different password associated with their Azure AD environment. So then the next day, they go into the office, and they try to log into the on-premises environment using their recently changed password, and it gets rejected because of that password mismatch. And so maybe at that point, they try to use their old password. So they log in with their old password, but now they're unable to access Azure AD resources because it's protected with a different password. So hash synchronization just prevents all of those password mismatch issues. It makes life a little bit more convenient for the end users, and it also helps to reduce the number of account lockouts. So you're probably going to reduce help desk call volume as well, simply because users aren't going to be locking themselves out quite as often. So just a few things to think about. On to the next one. Best practice number 3 is that visibility matters. So the idea here is that, let's say you've got your on-premises environment and you're also using Azure AD, and you're synchronizing your on-premises Active Directory objects up to Azure AD. Do you really want that traffic going across the public internet? Because think about how sensitive the contents of your Active Directory are. Now, I get it. That traffic is encrypted. It's HTTPS encrypted, and you may be using a number of other things to encrypt it further. So you might have multiple layers of encryption protecting that traffic, and that might be totally fine. That may be well within your accepted level of risk, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking for an added layer of security, then what Microsoft recommends is not routing that Azure AD synchronization traffic across the public internet. So how do you avoid doing that? Well, there's something that you can get called Azure Express Route. And what it is it's a tool that you can use to help prevent sensitive Active Directory information from having to transit the public internet. It completely bypasses the internet. So essentially what this does is it routes the traffic through a trusted provider rather than using the public internet. So you've got a direct route to Microsoft's data center, or a semi-direct route in some cases. And there are any number of benefits to doing this. One, it eliminates the possibility that somebody on the internet is going to be sniffing your traffic. But, if we're to be totally real about it, there's probably a very minor risk of that simply because of all of the encryption that's being used. But there are other benefits as well. Using something like ExpressRoute can help to reduce traffic latency. They can help improve performance. And it just makes everything perform a little bit better. So how does this work? Well, I don't want to turn this presentation into a deep dive into ExpressRoute, but I did pull this diagram off of the Microsoft website just so that you could get a feel for what this actually does. So if you look on the left side of the diagram, you see a box labeled Customers Network. This represents the on-premises network for whoever happens to be using ExpressRoute. Then we have the Partner Edge. So in other words, your network is going to connect directly to a trusted Microsoft partner at that point. And that could be a multi-step process. I've heard of organizations going through a co-location facility and then connecting to the Partner Edge, whereas other organizations might connect directly to the Partner Edge. It really kind of depends on the availability of cabling and things like that and what services are offered in certain areas. So at any rate, the Microsoft Customers Network connects to the Partner Edge, and then you'll notice that there are redundant connections. There's a primary connection that the traffic is supposed to go through, but then there's also a secondary connection that is used as a backup if the primary connection were to fail, or I'm not 100% sure on this, but I've heard that that secondary connection can also be used if the primary connection were to become saturated. Not sure on that one. At any rate, those connections then link to the Microsoft Edge. Now, when I say Microsoft Edge, I'm not talking about the browser. I'm talking about the edge of Microsoft's network. And then from there, it's routed to the appropriate resource. You can see that there's a red arrow and a blue arrow. The red points to Microsoft peering for Office 365, Dynamics 365, Azure Public Services, and things like that, whereas the blue goes to Azure Private Peering for virtual networks. So that's just a quick taste of how the ExpressRoute works. So best practice number 4, enable single sign-on. So single sign-on is exactly what we all think it is. It's just a tool for helping users to log on once, and then they don't have to manage a million different passwords for a million different applications. Now, there are countless different flavors of single sign-on out there, and it tends to mean different things to different people. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to be focusing primarily on Azure and Azure AD. So I pulled 2 quotes from the Microsoft webpage that I mentioned earlier. The first one, use SSO to enable users to access their SaaS applications based on their work or school account in Azure AD. This is applicable not only for Microsoft SaaS apps, but also for other apps such as Google Apps and Salesforce. So what this is essentially saying is that every organization, or I should say almost every organization, uses a number of software as a service or SaaS applications. And even though I'm sure Microsoft would prefer that you only use Microsoft 365 and Dynamics and things like that, they're realistic enough to know that they're not the only game in town, that there are a ton of other applications in the cloud that businesses use. things like the Google Cloud applications, things like Google Docs and Sheets and stuff like that, Salesforce, and a million other applications. So what Microsoft has done is they've provided APIs that allow these applications to accept Microsoft authentication. So that's what this is really talking about, is using single sign-on to access those third-party SaaS applications. And so then the second quote on the list is, organizations that don't create a common identity to establish SSO for their users and applications are more exposed to scenarios where users have multiple passwords. These scenarios increase the likelihood of users reusing their passwords or using weak passwords. So let me break this one down a little bit. SSO or single sign-on in some circles has gotten kind of a bad reputation from a security perspective. The idea being that if someone happens to gain access to a user's password, then because single sign-on is in place, they have access to everything that the user has access to, regardless of where that application or workload is located. So if somebody were to gain access to a particular user account, they not only have access to the resources that reside on premises, but if the organization uses single sign-on, then they also gain access to all of the various cloud applications that the user uses. That's one way of thinking of SSO. But what Microsoft is saying here is that using SSO can actually improve security if you enforce the use of really strong passwords. Because SSO can be used as a tool for helping to reduce the number of passwords that a user has to remember, because the SSO backend actually takes care of the authentication process. So there's a lot of these passwords that the user doesn't even have to mess with. So the user only has to remember possibly one password at that point, which means that since the user isn't having to juggle a million different passwords, they're less prone to write their password down or use the same password on multiple sites, which is a lot more risky, or engage in other really bad password practices. So as you can see, there are two different ways of thinking of SSO. You just have to consider what's going to be right for your own organization. Okay, best practice number 5, use conditional access policies. And then Microsoft goes on to say that configure common Azure AD conditional access policies based on group, location, and application sensitivity for SaaS apps and Azure AD connected apps. Now, what are conditional access policies? Well, conditional access policies are policies that exist in the Azure AD cloud, or in the Azure cloud within Azure AD, and you do have to have an Azure AD premium subscription to be able to use these. And they work kind of like if-then statements. And the way that these work is that there's something called a signal, and then decisions are made based on the signal and on the policies that you create. So how does this work? Well, some of the common signals include things like user or group memberships, IP location information, devices that the end user might be using, the applications that the user is using, real-time calculated risk detection, and Microsoft Defender for cloud apps. So in other words, when a user attempts to gain access to a particular resource, you can look at any one of, I started to say any one of the things that I just named, but you can actually look at more than one. So you take a look at these different signals, and then you make a decision based on the policies that you've put in place, and then you take action, and that action is called a decision. So what does the decision look like? Well, typically, a decision involves one of three things. You can either grant access to the resource, you can block access to the resource, or you can grant access but put certain restrictions in place. For example, you might say, okay, I'm going to allow this user to access this resource, but because one of these signals was deemed to be risky, I'm going to require multi-factor authentication before I'm going to allow access to the resource. And requiring multi-factor authentication is really just one of the restrictions that you can put on the granting of access to a resource. You can do other things like requiring a particular device to be marked as compliant, and that can involve any number of different things. For example, you might require a user to be working from a domain-joined PC, or if the user is working from a mobile device, you might require that that device have an up-to-date operating system and not be jailbroken. There are any number of different things that you can require. You can require the user to be using an approved client app. You can require an app protection policy. So there's lots of things that you can do. So how might you use conditional access policies in your own organization? Well, the common example that I often throw out is that let's say that you've got a particular user who comes into the office every Monday morning at 9 a.m., logs on, and the very first thing that they do is open up a particular application. And they do this week after week, every Monday morning like clockwork. Well, that's a very recognizable pattern from a security standpoint. You can almost set your watch by it. Okay, at this time, this user is going to log on to this PC or this device, and they're going to access this particular application. But let's say that the user ends up logging on from a system on the other side of the world within a rogue nation that you don't trust, and they access the application or attempt to access the application at 3 o'clock in the morning in that scenario. Well, that's very, very out of the ordinary for that user, and that might raise some red flags. It should raise some red flags. So that's one of the things that you might want to watch for. The point being that conditional access policies give you tools to make really rich policy decisions based on users, their devices, and their general behavior, so that you can, rather than providing users blanket access to resources, you can choose in the moment when the user tries to access that resource if it's really in your best interest to allow that access or not. So rather than using a static access control list that grants the user access to that resource every single time, you can make a decision at the time of access as to whether or not you want to allow that access to go through. So what else? The next thing that's listed on the slide is block legacy authentication protocols. Attackers exploit weaknesses in older protocols every day, particularly for password spray attacks. Conditional access to block legacy protocols. And then it goes on to say use MFA. So what's the deal with blocking legacy authentication protocols? Well, as the slide says, blocking legacy authentication protocols, and this is something that Microsoft is working toward, prevents attackers from attempting to use web logon portals to do a spray attack. So what's a password spray attack? Well, depending on where you look on the web, there are a few different definitions. It kind of seems to be one of those things that nobody can agree 100% on what they are. But here's the way that I think of it. Let's say that you're an attacker and you want to exploit or you want to gain access to a particular organization. Now, you're pretty sure that you're not going to be able to just do a true brute force crack on the organization because the organization probably has an account lockout policy in place. So if you enter a bad password for an account, say 3, maybe 5 different times, then that account's going to get locked out and you don't get to try anymore. So the attackers know this. So what they can do instead is, rather than just trying to do a brute force crack, which they know isn't going to work, and even if account lockout policies were in place, it's going to take way, way too much time. Instead of doing that, they can use targeted passwords. So maybe, for example, they call the organization's help desk, posing as a user, and they request a password reset. And the help desk tells them, okay, your new password is 1234, and it's going to require you to change your password as soon as you log in. And it's probably going to be something stronger than 1234. That was just the first thing that popped into my head. Well, at that point, that attacker knows that 1234 or whatever the help desk told them is the default password that's often used when account reset or password resets are performed, and most likely when new accounts are set up. So that might be something that they would include in their password spray attack. Something else that they might do is passwords that are deemed to be really common. There are actually lists out there on the internet of the most commonly used passwords. So an attacker might leverage such a list and figure out what the most commonly used passwords are and include that in their spray attack. Or maybe they even modify that a little bit to include things like the company name or maybe the name of a regional sports team or something like that. Just something that there's a high probability that somebody in the organization will end up using as their password. And so then they'll try to perform multiple logons to every single account in the organization using this preset list of just a few passwords and hope that somebody happens to be using one of those passwords. And then that will give them entry to the organization. So blocking legacy authentication protocols will help to prevent that type of attack from happening. Now, when it comes to blocking legacy authentication protocols, you do have to be careful, because even though Microsoft is working to get rid of those types of protocols, there are still things out there that use it. And the same thing goes with multi-factor authentication. Microsoft has been pushing multi-factor authentication really, really hard over the last couple of years, and for good reason. There are studies out there that show that multi-factor authentication can block the vast majority of attacks against end-user accounts. The statistics vary widely. I've seen some figures as low as 80%, other figures as high as 99%. But the point being that using multi-factor authentication can block the vast majority of logon attempts from cyber criminals. But the problem with multi-factor authentication and with, or the problem with requiring multi-factor authentication and with turning off legacy authentication protocols is that you usually can't do it across the board, because typically there will be some legacy element in place that requires it. For example, a lot of workloads out there leverage the use of service accounts, and service accounts can't use multi-factor authentication. So you really don't want to put a policy in place that requires multi-factor authentication for every account in your Active Directory, because otherwise you're probably going to have some applications that end up failing simply because the service accounts that are associated with those applications aren't able to log on and gain the permissions that the application needs in order to operate. So that's just one example. The point being, you should definitely get rid of legacy authentication wherever you can, and you should be using multi-factor authentication wherever possible, but don't do it recklessly. Okay, best practice number 6, and this one is one of my personal favorites. Plan for routine security improvements. So what does this one mean? Well, the idea behind this is that security shouldn't be thought of as a set it and forget it proposition. You're not going to just wake up one day and say, okay, I've done everything that I can possibly do, we're secure, and now I never have to touch security again. And I know that example sounds really ridiculous, but surprisingly, this is the way that some organizations approach the idea of security. They go in with a checklist, they knock out as many of the checklist items as their budget and their operational constraints will allow, and then they consider themselves to be secure. Maybe they even pass some kind of security audit, and then just don't really think all that much about it for quite some time after that. And security really doesn't work that way. Let me give you a great example. I got into IT in the 90s. And back then, one of the big security best practices that was often pushed is you absolutely gotta make sure that users use 8-character passwords. And the complexity didn't even matter back then. As long as your users are using 8-character passwords, you were going to be so secure. Well, guess what? There's an organization called Hive that puts out a chart every year. And this chart displays the amount of time that it would take a cyber criminal to brute force crack a password based on the available computing power. So right now that means computing power that is found in the cloud. And for an 8-character password, a cyber criminal would be able to crack it in minutes. Depending on the complexity, that really determines how long it takes to crack it. Let me give you an example here. Let me pull this up. I hadn't planned on looking at this, but it just so happens I've got it on one of my monitors. Okay, so according to the Hive chart, an 8-character password that consists solely of numbers can be cracked instantly based on today's computing power. If you're using a combination of numbers and lowercase letters, that 8-character password can still be cracked instantly. If you're using upper and lowercase letters and numbers, it would take a cyber criminal a whole 2 minutes to crack that password. If you're using a combination of numbers, uppercase, and lowercase letters, or excuse me, I just did that one. But then if you're using numbers, upper and lowercase letters, and symbols, then it's going to take 39 minutes. So the point being that no matter how complex a password is, the whole idea that you should have an 8-character password in today's world is ridiculous. So let's circle back to the whole concept of plan for routine security improvements. Imagine if an organization didn't routinely reevaluate their security, and they stuck with this whole idea from so long ago that, hey, your passwords have got to be 8 characters long. Well, that organization would be very insecure by today's standards. And in case anybody is wondering, the real tipping point on when a password becomes secure, well, it's kind of debatable, but I tend to think of it as being right around the 11 to 12 character range, so long as you're requiring complexity. My hope is that we'll eventually get to the point where we're using passwordless authentications universally, but for now we're stuck using passwords in a lot of situations. So I would strongly recommend using at least 12 characters and enforcing password complexity requirements. But what about Microsoft's recommendations? Well, there were 2 quotes on that particular article that stuck out to me with regard to this best practice. The first one, plan routine security reviews and improvements based on the best practices in your industry. The idea behind this one, at least as I interpret it, is that you've got to schedule these things. Because if you just say, oh yeah, we're going to periodically review security, it'll never happen, or it won't happen nearly frequently enough. So I recommend taking a formalized approach and saying, okay, every 6 months we're going to go through, we're going to take a hard look at all of our security resources and see what might be getting outdated. Are there any group policy settings we need to change? Are there any infrastructure components that are going to be needed to be updated in an effort to bolster security? What can we do? What should we be doing? The next recommendation is use the Identity Secure Score feature to rank your improvements over time. Now, Identity Secure Score is something that I've talked about several times in recent years, and it's really similar to the Microsoft 365 Secure Score, but it's based primarily on identity. It's a part of Azure AD. So the idea behind this is that you get a score, and that score is expressed as a percentage of the total possible points that you can accumulate. And so down at the very bottom of the slide on the left, you can see a list of improvement actions. We have things on the list like use least privileged administrative roles, protect all users with a user risk policy, designate more than one global admin, enable policy to block legacy authentication. So we have all of these actions that can be taken in order to improve security, particularly as it relates to identity. And remember what I said at the very beginning of the presentation, identity is the new perimeter. This is where you want to focus your security efforts. So right here, Microsoft is giving you a list of things that you can do to improve that identity security. So for each one of these items, you have a score impact. So in other words, if you look at the very first item on the list, use least privileged administrative roles, if you do that, that's going to improve your score by 1.79%. Then we have the user impact. In other words, how much of an impact is this going to make on your user? Is it going to be something that once you do it, the users aren't even going to notice that anything's changed? Or is it going to drastically change the way that they have to log in? So that's something that's really important to know when you're deciding whether or not you want to implement one of these improvement actions, is what's the overall effect going to be on my users? Then the very last column, we have the implementation cost. Because remember, a lot of security features are built into Azure AD, and you can use them today. But at the same time, there are also security features that require an Azure AD Premium subscription. And so there's a cost associated with those improvement actions if you don't already have an Azure AD Premium subscription. So that cost is certainly something that you want to consider. Oh, and one more thing I want to point out about this chart is that if you look at the upper right corner, you can see a score history tracked over time. So as you implement improvement actions, you'll notice this chart change, and you'll be able to tell if your organization is becoming more or less secure over time. But how might it become less secure? Well, it could become less secure if Microsoft changes its improvement actions, and suddenly there are improvement actions that appear on the list that are brand new that you haven't implemented yet. And that really goes back to the whole idea of performing periodic security reviews, because best practices do change over time, and it's really important to keep pace with those changes. So best practice number 7, enable password management. According to Microsoft, you should set up self-service password reset for your users, and then monitor if and how self-service password reset is really being used. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the Microsoft solution. There are some really, really good third-party products out there that will do the exact same thing. But the basic idea is that if you allow users to reset their own passwords, then it's going to make life easier on your end users. They don't have to take the time to pick up the phone, call the help desk, and, oh, it's the weekend, there's nobody here that can help you with that, or this is the 5th time this week that I've requested a password reset, I'm so embarrassed, or, deal with things like that. So they can instantly reset their own passwords without anybody being any the wiser. From the organization standpoint, this could end up being one of those things that saves a significant amount of money. There are numerous studies out there that attach a dollar amount to every password reset request that an organization receives. And as you can imagine, these estimates vary widely based on organization size and based on who's doing the study. But some of the studies out there show that the cost of every single phone call in a large enterprise environment from a user, or a phone call from a user requesting a password reset, is about $70. Now, in a way that sounds weird because there's no direct cost associated with a password reset. It's something you can do for free. But I think that these studies that put these dollar figures on these password reset requests are looking at things like lost productivity and the amount of time that users waste and help desk technicians waste completing that password reset. And then the slide goes on to say, extend cloud-based password policies to your on-premises infrastructure, enhance password policies in your organization by performing the same checks for on-premises password changes as you do for cloud-based password changes. Install Azure AD password protection for Windows servers or for Windows Server Active Directory agents on-premises to extend banned password lists to your existing infrastructure. And then it goes on with some more. So what this is really getting at is if you were ever in question that Microsoft places more importance on Azure than they do on on-premises deployments, all you have to really do is look at the differences in the Active Directory security features that are offered in the Azure AD or in the Azure cloud as compared with what you can get on an on-premises server. There's a lot more that you can do with Active Directory security in the Azure cloud as a part of Azure AD, particularly with the premium subscriptions, than what you can do on site. But it is possible using something called Azure AD password protection to extend the password policies that you have in the Azure cloud down to your on-premises Active Directory environment. So what this means is that you can now take advantage of some of those features that only exist in the cloud normally. So the way that you would do this is by installing an agent on your on-premises domain controllers. So what does that really get you? Well, at a high level, the main things that you get is access to a global banned password list and custom banned password lists. So what are these lists? Well, there are lists out on the dark web of billions of passwords that are known to have been leaked. And these passwords are hashed so that if somebody wants to perform a crack, they don't necessarily have to do a brute force crack on the entire password. Instead, what they can do is they can just hash the password and then do a table lookup, and it's much, much faster for them to do that than to attempt a brute force crack of a password. So it's really important, even if a particular account hasn't been leaked, if a password, or excuse me, if someone else was using a password that's identical to what is being used for an account in your organization and that password has been leaked, that puts the password that's in use in your organization at risk too, even though it's associated with a completely different account that's never been compromised. So it's really important to avoid using any banned passwords, passwords that have previously been exploited. And again, there are some really good third-party tools that do this as well. Now, for a custom banned password list, an organization can go through and create a list of things that they don't want users to be able to use in their password. For example, an organization might prevent users from including the company name as a part of a password, or maybe a favorite sports team or some popular music groups or movies or things like that. What I find really interesting about the way that Microsoft does this is that they're not doing a direct lookup on banned passwords, because there are plenty of ways that a user could dodge that. Instead, what they do is they use a process called normalization. So let's say, for example, that I were to add the word password to a custom banned password list. It's probably already on the banned password list, but let's just say I put that in the custom password list or custom banned password list. And a user knows this. They wouldn't normally know it, but let's say that they do. And they decide to try to skirt that. So instead of entering password, they enter a capital P and then the @ symbol and then SSW0RD. So they've satisfied complexity requirements, and it doesn't match anything that's on the banned password list. Great, the user can use that password, right? Not so fast. This is where the process that I mentioned called normalization comes into play. And I don't really have time to go into everything associated with normalization, but the idea is that Microsoft takes that password and they'll look for substitutions. Like, for example, I used the $ in place of an S. So they would replace $ with the letter S. They would replace zeros with the letter O and things like that. And then they would compare it to the banned password list. And the process is actually quite a bit more complicated than that. They use a system of numerical scoring. The point is that they don't do literal lookups from this banned password list. So it's really effective the way that they're doing this. And you can bring that to your on-premises environment, so you're not limited solely to using these lists in the cloud. So let's see. Looks like I got about 4 minutes left. Okay, so best practice number 8 is enable multi-factor authentication. And I talked about this one quite a bit earlier. There are several different ways of doing it. You can either enable it in the traditional way, or you can use it as a part of a conditional access policy. So if a particular condition is fulfilled, then maybe you want to require conditional access policy as giving a little bit more security to a user request for access to a resource. Best practice number 9, use role-based access control. I think most of us are probably familiar with role-based access control, or RBAC as it's often called. Role-based access control is a mechanism that makes it easy to segregate administrative responsibilities. For example, if you've got an administrator who is over your Exchange environment, but they have nothing to do with Active Directory users or managing your SQL Server or something like that, well, then you can set up an RBAC role and give them access to manage the Exchange server, but not to be able to have any kind of elevated permissions over anything else. So that helps to limit the blast radius if that account were to become compromised. If an attacker logs in, they gain access to that account, they can only do what that account has permissions to do. That account's not going to have the global admin permissions that would allow a total takeover of the entire environment. Now, having said that, it's worth noting that role-based access control can give you a false sense of security. Because remember, it doesn't do anything by itself to prevent an account from becoming compromised. All it does is help to limit the damage that can occur after the account is compromised. The other thing to keep in mind with regard to RBAC is that permission sprawl and permission accumulation can become an issue, particularly in this world of ever-decreasing IT budgets, where a single administrator might be given responsibilities over multiple systems. Well, if that administrator is given our permissions over several different systems, what they have is the cumulative total of all of those permissions from those RBAC roles. And so that may end up putting that administrator in a situation where they have more permissions than what they really need or what you would like them to have in order for the organization to remain secure. Okay, best practice number 10, lower exposure of privileged accounts. Essentially what Microsoft is getting at with this particular best practice is that it's important to manage, control, and monitor access to privileged accounts, which is kind of a no-brainer. You know, if somebody is logging into your enterprise admin account, you want to know about it. So there's a mechanism called Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, and again, you're going to need an Azure AD Premium subscription in order to use this. But once you turn this on, then you'll receive notifications anytime that there is a privileged access role change. So if, for example, an attacker were to compromise an account in your organization, a lot of times one of the first things that they'll do is create their own privileged account, because that will make future access easier for them, especially if the method that they used to get in is cut off. Then, you know, they've got this other account that they've created that they can fall back on. So enabling Azure AD Privileged Identity Management will let you receive an email message if something like that were to happen. So if all of a sudden you have a new privileged account that shows up for no reason, you'll know about it. Or if somebody makes a change to a privileged account, you'll know about that too. And then Microsoft goes on to say that you should take a look at all of your admin accounts and just make sure that none of these privileged groups have anything that doesn't belong there. And this is important. This is something that I just recently did in my own organization, but they take it a step further and mention that these groups shouldn't include any consumer accounts from things like Hotmail or Microsoft accounts or Live.com or Outlook.com or anything like that. I mean, honestly, I never even thought about somebody using one of these consumer-grade accounts. in a privileged group, but it kind of makes sense that it could be done. So that's certainly something that you should be on the lookout for. And then it looks like I'm just going to make it on time. But the last best practice is to actively monitor for suspicious activity. And again, this is one of those things that you're going to need either a third-party tool or you're going to need an Azure AD Premium subscription. But if you have that Azure AD Premium subscription, then that gives you access to something, to a mechanism that will allow you to create anomaly reports. So an anomaly report is just a report of activity that's occurred within your Azure AD environment that might be abnormal and might signal that there's a problem. Now, most of the time, these anomalies are probably, nothing. They're the result of a user doing something a little bit different than what they would normally do. But it's important to review nonetheless because they can signal an attack in progress. So I recommend if you have access to these reports, run the reports daily and take the time to review them just to make sure that there's nothing troubling on that report. So what should you be looking for in the report? Well, there's a few things. Look for any attempts to sign on without being traced, brute force attacks against a particular account, attempts to sign on from multiple locations, sign-ons from infected devices, and suspicious IP addresses. So with that said, I want to go ahead and open it up for questions while we've got a couple minutes left.
Okay, yeah, great talk, Brian. Let's jump right into the questions. First one is from Joel. For conditional access block legacy authentication protocols, what is the best practice for printer scanners where the manufacturers don't seem to update the authentication methods?
Yeah, in a situation like that, you may have to leave a legacy authentication enabled. My recommendation would be to only disable the legacy protocols that you're able to. There's some that you may end up just having to leave enabled for reasons exactly like what you said.
Okay, great. Next question. Let's see. Are there any potential disadvantages to disabling legacy authentication protocols?
Yeah, exactly that. There are things that depend on them. You may have certain service accounts that require a legacy authentication protocol. You may have web-based clients that can only connect to a workload using a legacy authentication protocol. So until you've modernized everything and you can totally do away with it, you do have to be careful about disabling those protocols and make sure that you're not turning off something that is required in order for everything to function properly.
Okay. Here's a question from Cynthia. What about IAM being placed on a subnet or another domain on the network? What are the benefits?
What are the benefits of IAM being placed on a subnet or on, what was the last part of that?
Domain on the network.
I don't know. I guess IAM is kind of the cloud-based way of doing things. It's a way that you can assign permissions to cloud-based networks. So depending on how you're using it, and it's kind of a tough question to answer just because I don't know all of the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish. But depending on how you implement it, it may allow you to extend those cloud-based identities to on-premises resources or resources in other clouds so that you just have one source of, or one identity per user, and you can regulate access control based on that one identity.
Okay. Okay. What is it to stop self-service password reset from being exploited by someone who wants to gain access to an account?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so let's say that somebody, a cyber criminal, wants to gain access to an account out there, and they know that your organization is using self-service password reset. What's to stop them from just figuring out a user's email address, which is really easy to do. You can get it off LinkedIn or a million other places. I've even heard of cyber criminals figuring out what format an organization uses for their user identities just by looking at the email address associated with another account and then piecing things together like, okay, what's the CEO's name? What's the standard email format they use? And getting an address that way. So, a cyber criminal could theoretically, once they know the email address, try to use that as that self-service password reset mechanism as a way of gaining access to the account. But what stops them from being able to do that is that there are usually multiple layers of authentication that are required before that password reset is granted. So maybe Azure AD sends a text message to the user's mobile device and asks them to enter a code. And of course, the number for that mobile device is pre-populated in the Active Directory. It's not something that is being supplied on the spot. So I guess that's a really roundabout way of saying that there are multiple levels of authentication in place to prevent that mechanism from being exploited by a cyber criminal.
Okay, Nick has a question about something you touched on earlier. If best practice is to centralize identity management, don't synchronize accounts to Azure AD that have high privileges in your existing Active Directory instance violate that idea?
Yeah, if you were to take this really literally, then sure, that would absolutely violate that idea. I think what that really comes down to is that security is a trade-off. You're going to have to do what's going to be right for your own organization, balance all the best practices with practicality, because sometimes the best practices just aren't completely practical, or they may be, as you pointed out, contradictory best practices. Mm-hmm. So you're just going to have to balance those best practices with what's going to work best in your own organization and give you the desired level of security.
Okay, how might a break glass account differ from a standard enterprise admin account?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't really get a chance to get into break glass accounts, but it was on one of the slides. The idea being that a break glass account is essentially an enterprise admin account that has access to everything. So how's that different from a normal enterprise admin account? A normal enterprise admin account is one of those things that's used sparingly if there's a task that requires that level of access. A break glass account, on the other hand, is an account that is only used in an absolute dire emergency. You've completely locked yourself out of the network and have no other way of getting back in. So with a break glass account, what you would typically do is create an account, give it access to absolutely everything, turn off a lot of the security associated with that. So that break glass account shouldn't require multi-factor authentication. There shouldn't be restrictions associated with using it. But then you assign that account a really, really, really strong password. You print it out, lock it away in a safe, hopefully never to be seen again, but it's only to be used in those really, really dire situations.
Okay, looks like we have just one more question for you from Cynthia. In the setup of user emails, Outlook will resolve to readable username. We use a naming protocol prior to the @domain.xxx. We have much less in the way of junk mail, etc. Is this really helping us?
I don't know. I think you could probably make a case for either. I don't know. I don't really have a way of knowing the answer to that.
Okay. Good emails. Yeah, I think that's all we have now. Thanks so much, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Everyone, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our third session, Hottest Third-Party Solutions, and the giveaway of our high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling Bluetooth headphones, which you must be present to win. We'll be right back.